All right, this is block 6, note number 3, the nullification crisis. We have talked in this class earlier about sectional tensions, the division of the United States into North, South, and West, with different ideals, goals, and different societies, different cultures. And this division was apparent from colonial times, from the very first, Virginia versus Massachusetts, that the tension between the sections was obvious. The biggest difference, of course, is in the structure of their economies. As time goes on, the North develops a free labor, capitalist, industrial, manufacturing, banking-centered economy of free labor. The South develops an agricultural system of plantation farming based on the labor of slaves. And those just create two entirely different cultures. A free culture in the North and an aristocratic culture based on slavery in the South. Threats of disunion had been exclaimed by aggrieved parties in the early years of the Republic. You had the Essex junto about splitting off New England. You had the extreme Federalists at the Hartford Convention. When people were arguing over the Missouri Compromise, people were saying, we're going to split up the country rather than compromise. That the two sections that were just kind of glued together by the Constitution. And sometimes that glue had been threatened. One of the things that divided the sections was the tariff. Hamilton's tariff had remained in place long after Hamilton's death through the early 19th century, protecting the infant industries of the North. And it benefited the North, and it benefited manufacturing, and it benefited trade, and it benefited industry, and it did not benefit the South. Reciprocal tariffs put in place by European countries. That means if the United States has a tariff against European goods, European countries are going to have a tariff against American goods. And this reciprocal tariff caused the finished goods and the luxury goods that the elite planters liked to be more expensive. And more importantly, it made Southern cotton less competitive. That Southern planters who made their fortunes selling cotton always worried that if the Europeans could get cotton elsewhere for cheaper, they'd be ruined. For a long time, there is very little noise in the North about actually abolishing slavery. The biggest thing that divided the North from the South was the tariff. And then the South, so the South the South always has this inferiority complex. The South always looks at the rest of the country as wanting to dominate it. That they're smaller, they're weaker, they have less power in the House of Representatives, they have less power in the presidency. One could even argue that in their heart of hearts they were ashamed about slavery. But Southerners were always the ones that were arguing for their own rights and their own, part of the country, and that you had better be careful up there north or we'll just leave. They were kind of like that friend who was a little overly dramatic about a lot of things. And it was in a case of over-dramatization that the South came up with kind of the next step in the road to the Civil War. You started with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, if you remember, that states had the right to declare things unconstitutional. And then you had interposition, which said that the states could interpose their authority when the federal government threatened them. And then you have what's known as the compact theory. And the compact theory is going to give a philosophical basis for this belief, the belief that the states are more powerful than the national government. A senator from South Carolina, Robert Y. Hayne, discussed this on the floor of Congress one day. And he said that the Constitution was a compact of states. And then he called it the compact theory. That the states had gotten together to make a club. And they called this club the United States of America. And the rules of the club were the Constitution. And Senator Hayne said, once the Constitution was not working for everyone, once the country was not working for everyone, you could just leave. It would be like joining a club at school, he would say. You join a club at school, all of a sudden the other people in the club start saying nasty things about you. They don't make you feel welcome. They make you feel insulted. It would obviously be your right, he said, to leave the club. And that, in a sentence, is the compact theory. At first, it sounds very reasonable. Who amongst us would want to be stuck in a club that was no longer any fun for us? Daniel Webster, the great senator from the North, the great senator from Massachusetts, took the floor after Senator Hayne had spoke and blasted his argument to hell. He said that the Constitution was not a compact of states, but it was a compact of we the people. It was a compact of the people of the United States, not just the states. And because of that, since the people had brought the states into the country, the states could not just pick up and leave. That all the people in the country would have to agree to split up for there to be disunion. His speaking ability was great, and he was a powerful speaker, and his argument won the day. And it made him into a political star, and he would run for president on that political star. And it kind of quieted the South for a little while, but in the back of all their minds, they said, this compact theory might be something we could hang our collective hats on. And then we're going to take it one step further, one step closer to actual violence, and that was in the Southern theory of what's called nullification. Calhoun. Here's John C. Calhoun as a young man. He starts to get a little goofy looking when he's an old man. You want to fire him up as an old man for us today? There's Calhoun as a young man in the Senate. And there's John C. Calhoun as an old man. Had his crazy hair. Calhoun was the senator who most eloquently represented the South. He had been Jackson's vice president during his first term, but due to his extreme views on states' rights, had been replaced by Martin Van Buren. Jackson and Calhoun are very close politically on everything except for state-federal relations. And they dislike each other personally. And that's going to play a role in the story to come. They were politically close on everything but the big issue and did not like each other personally. Calhoun was an aristocrat. He was one of the planter elite. He had not come from poverty like Jackson had come from, and Jackson did not much like him for that. But he was a very smart guy, Calhoun was. And he published a work called his Exposition and Protest. And in it, he goes into more detail about the compact theory. He said in Exposition and Protest that the Constitution was created by the states. Therefore, the states had the final meeting on what was constitutional and what was not constitutional. That according to Exposition and Protest, according to the compact theory, the states had the final say on the meaning of the Constitution. And then he took it to the realm of action. Calhoun said that if a state felt a law was unconstitutional, then it could call a special state convention representing the sovereignty of the people of that state. And this special state convention could interpose its authority and nullify a federal law. And to nullify means to make null. So if a state felt something was unconstitutional, it could call a convention, and this convention representing the entire state could declare a federal law null and void and nullify it. And that's what's going to lead us to what's called the nullification crisis. To understand the Civil War and to understand the run-up to it, it is so important to get into the minds of the elite Southerners who ran the South. They thought they were the cream of the crop of American culture and American society. They had the most beautiful houses, they had the most beautiful lives, they were up to date on the latest fashions, they were literate and urbane and sophisticated and slave owners. And they felt that the increasing criticism of slavery in the North, it began to affect them personally. It began to bother them that slavery was coming under more and more attack. The slave trade had been outlawed in 1808, the international slave trade, but before the deadline, lots of slaves from Africa had been imported into the United States, especially in South Carolina. And to the planter elite, who did not love black people to begin with, when they saw black people directly off the boat from Africa that had not been acculturated to slavery in America for dozens of generations, like their slaves they had known were, they looked at these recent arrivals from Africa and honestly thought they were little better than animals. At least their slaves kind of knew their role and spoke English and were Christian and, you know, kind of were used to slavery. Not the new arrivals. And they looked at them and, even more so than before, began thinking about things purely in terms of race. Two major slave revolts had happened. If you want to pull up a man by the name of Denmark Vesey. A slave revolt by the name, a slave by the name of Denmark Vesey. There he is. He was a slave who had bought his freedom, and Mr. Vesey planned to go, that's perfect right there. Mr. Vesey planned to go back to the South and plan a slave revolt. An incredibly brave man, first of all, to buy your freedom, leave the South, and then come back to arm the slaves and plan a revolt, speaks to hatred for slavery and a personal bravery that's incredibly admirable. He was found out before he got started. His rebellion was crushed and Vesey was hanged. The next one is by a man by the name of Nat Turner. Nat Turner's uprising. See? There he is. That's obviously an artist's interpretation. Nat Turner's uprising, he was a slave. Nat Turner led the most successful slave revolt in American history. He and his men killed between 55 and 65 whites. And of course, the whites struck back with a vengeance, killing over 200 slaves and eventually tracking down Turner, capturing him and hanging him. So you have this sense in the South that the North is growing more and more anti-slavery. The slaves are more animalistic than ever. The slaves are getting out of hand. The slaves are getting out of control. And then you add a new tariff law in 1832. It lowered the tariff much less than the South wanted. And you add those two things and the South starts to get paranoid. They start to connect the tariff with slavery and start to think that the North has this big plot to get rid of the power of the South. They figured if we give ground on one, if we let up our guard on the tariff, the next thing coming down is, you know, opposition to slavery. And if we let our opposition to slavery falter, they're going to give us the highest tariff in the world. The issues are unrelated in reality, but reality is not what's important sometimes. What's important sometimes is what people think. And Southerners thought they were linked, and Southerners felt that the rights of the Southern states had to be protected. When the tariff law passed and was found unacceptable in South Carolina, talk of nullification began immediately. President Jackson realized immediately that the threat of nullification would be mortal to the Union. He figured, look, if you, a state, can just interpret the Constitution however you want and threaten to leave whenever you don't get your way, there's no way the country can survive. And there's a lot of truth in that. That if you have a group of friends and one person is always saying, I'm not going to be your friend anymore if I don't get my way, that group of friendship is not long for the world. And Jackson said a state does not have the right to just declare different parts of the law acceptable or not. And he sent a message to the nullifiers in South Carolina. Quote, he said, you may, quote, talk and write resolutions and print threats to your heart's content. But if one drop of blood be shed in South Carolina in defiance of the laws of the United States, Jackson said, quote, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find. And knowing Jackson, they believed him. Most of the country believed him. South Carolina did not believe him. South Carolina thought he was bluffing. In November of 1832, a special state convention, just like in the Exposition and Protest, a special state convention was held and announced that in the sovereign state of South Carolina, the tariff would not be collected and the law would be nullified as of February 1st of the next year, February 1, 1833. They said on that date, South Carolina would no longer collect the tariff, and then they went and appropriated money to raise an army and supply it against the forces of the United States. Well, now Jackson's got a crisis. And this is probably Jackson's finest political moment. Jackson rises to the occasion in a very statesmanlike way. First, he began military preparations. That was the stick. But when you have a stick, you should also have a carrot. And Jackson said to South Carolina, look, I'm going to ask Congress to lower the tariff a little bit more. That's the carrot. In the back, he's got the army getting ready. But he says, look, let's lower the tariff a little more. Let's all relax here. He then directly addressed the people of South Carolina. In a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, he told them nullification meant the end of the Union. He told them that, look, for better or for worse, I'm the president, he said. My job is to execute the laws, whether we all like them or not. And he said, I am going to execute the laws, including the tariff. And he also reminded them that to take up arms against the United States was treason, one of the worst crimes imaginable. Calhoun, let's go back up to Mr. Calhoun. Calhoun, we can draw him old here, he's not a young man anymore in the 1830s. He's not quite, he's probably in between those two pictures. Calhoun realizes that he has lost control of events and is desperately looking for a way out. Jackson sort of personally threatened Calhoun and said, if he follows through on nullification, I will hang him as high as Haman, making a little biblical allusion there. And Calhoun was no coward, but Calhoun knew that Jackson might just be crazy enough to do it. In a prearranged, remember, he's also Vice President of the United States. He's Jackson's Vice President while this is all going on. In a prearranged maneuver, he resigns from the vice presidency. Senator Hayne from South Carolina also resigns, and Calhoun goes back to the Senate. And he is going to use his power in the Senate to look for a peaceful way out of this, where both sides save face. Calhoun does not want violence. He realizes that he's gone too close to the line. And now he's looking for a way to back off but not look like he's surrendering. Jackson continues to move. In Congress, he introduces what's known as the Force Bill, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is giving Jackson the right to raise an army of 200,000 men to ensure that the laws of the Union are carried out. South Carolina asks the other southern states for support. They refuse. Unionists in South Carolina promise if South Carolina secedes, they themselves will fight a civil war inside South Carolina. That's too much for Calhoun. 10 days before the deadline, South Carolina announces that nullification would be postponed, pending the outcome of the tariff debate in Congress. In March of 1833, Calhoun and the great compromiser Clay work together and push through a new tariff that is lower. South Carolina said, oh, that's acceptable to us, accepted the lower tariff, and the crisis passed. Jackson got his force bill through to kind of show his power. Both sides were looking for a way out, trying to look good. Jackson looked good, he got his force bill. South Carolina kind of covered itself by accepting the very slightly lowered tariff. And nullification passed. The crisis passed. But it showed a couple things, very important things, as history would show. First of all, it showed that the North and the West would go to very great lengths to compromise with the South. That when you look at it, the South didn't compromise very much at all. They were forced into their position by threat of military force. The North and the West were the ones willing to compromise on the tariff, willing to compromise on slavery, always willing to compromise. And the North and the West will go to great lengths to compromise with the South. South Carolina, the heart of the South, realized that without the support of the other southern states, it could do nothing against the power of the United States. That the United States versus South Carolina was a lose. Throw up a map of the United States in 1840 for me. Let's throw this one. Map of USA 1840, or USA map 1840. Map of USA 1840. Not that one. That one's good. Thank you. South Carolina versus all of the United States, no chance. South Carolina plus the rest of the South, possibly. With the planter elite believing that slavery was under ever-increasing attack, with the planter elite believing that the growth of the North and the West meant that they would forever be a minority in their own country, with the planter elite believing that the rest of the country was out to destroy them, the planter elite began to work to get all of the other southern states on South Carolina's side. And they began to believe that in the long run, the only way they could protect themselves and protect their culture and their economy and their way of life was to leave the United States entirely. It's going to take another 30 years, but in 1860, led by South Carolina, the rest of the South will secede from the Union. But for now, for 1830 and 1832, the Union has survived, Jackson has won again, and South Carolina and Calhoun kind of retreated with their tail between their legs. And that's nullification.